state parks are in jeopardy.
Cost of health care.
Higher taxes.
Pension reform.
There are solutions in California.
At the end of the day, this is good for California.
Welcome to California Connections, brought to you by the California Cable and Telecommunications Association. We offer you your window into politics and policy here in the Golden State. My name is Brad Pomerantz. Now this week our focus is on the state budget and how that spending plan affects state and local services up and down California. We'll also talk about the impacts all of us might feel in light of Stockton and at least one other city that declared bankruptcy in the face of their fiscal woes. Now, giving us insight on these and other issues will be State Treasurer Bill Lockyer. He is a former Attorney General and East Bay legislator before he was elected to statewide office. Bill Lockyer has earned a reputation in Sacramento for telling it like it is. No other public official in California is more qualified to talk about how budgets are made and what the impact proposed tax measures on November's ballot hold for all Californians. Later in our program, we present from the Capitol Press Corps and the Sacramento Press Club an unvarnished view from the state capitol. We'll hear what they have to say about the budget, about politics, and get their take on the November election. And finally, in an editorial minute, we'll find out what top Democrats and top Republican lawmakers feel about the key issues of the day. But first, this news.
The legislature began its summer recess with a bang, sending an on-time budget and trailer bills to the governor, along with a host of other legislation, including a homeowner's bill of rights, a new date for a $12 billion water bond, and an historic measure approving high-speed rail for California. For the second straight year, the legislature used its new authority to pass a majority vote budget and sent a $142 billion spending plan to the governor before the end of the fiscal year. The budget sent to the governor is balanced, but an additional $6 billion in spending cuts, mostly to education, could be triggered if voters reject Proposition 31, Governor Brown's proposed tax increase on the November ballot. If polls are any indication, however, the outcome of Proposition 31 is still up in the air. According to the field poll, voters currently support the governor's tax measure by a 54 to 38 margin, but have failed to embrace the other two tax measures on the ballot. On the other hand, that same field poll indicates that 1 in 5 voters currently supporting Prop 31 would reconsider their support if the legislature approved high-speed rail, which it did. On the final day before their month-long summer recess, the Senate approved and sent to the governor SB 1029, an act that appropriates more than $7 billion for the construction of high-speed rail. Long supported by Governor Brown, the measure passed the Assembly on a 52-28 vote, but ran into much tougher sledding in the Senate. After a long debate and with several key Democrats opposed, the bill passed 21-16 without a single vote to spare. In other key legislation, the legislature passed and Governor Brown signed AB 278 and SB 900, a two-bill package referred to as the Homeowner's Bill of Rights. Among other things, it would delay foreclosure proceedings while loan modification applications are under review, create a single point of contact for homeowners seeking a loan modification, and expand notice requirements. The package was sponsored by Attorney General Kamala Harris. And finally, the legislature acted to move a $12 billion water bond previously set for voter approval this November to 2014 instead. The bond measure was a result of long and delicate negotiations that balanced environmental concerns over water and wildlife with the needs of urban and agricultural water users. Its move reflects the hope that California's economy will be in better shape in 2014 and voters more inclined to pass the bonds. And that's the news.
Welcome back to California Connections. Of course, our guest, Bill Lockyer, he is the treasurer of the state of California. He has served as Attorney General in the Senate, in the Assembly. He has held several offices in our great state. And sir, I want to talk to you about the recent state budget passed. The first major issue with the state budget is we are now passing budgets by majority vote. When you were in the Assembly, you were in the Senate, no such luck, you needed 2/3. Right. What have you seen from that new process?
Well, it gets done on time. That's a good thing because we used to have these awful stalemates. Right. Because you'd have the large vote required of 2/3 and only 2 other states had that obligation in their state law.
Rhode Island, Arkansas.
Right. And so as a consequence, there would be negotiations going on about lots of things that weren't necessarily the budget. Whatever the minority party in this instance, and whatever happens in those states,
of course,
who would say, well, we're not going to vote for it until the following changes get made in environmental law or something else. And so that delayed often into the fall.
But at this stage, while we do have a majority vote for the budget, we still need a 2/3 vote for taxes.
Right.
So does the majority vote reform really reform the system at all?
Well, it means you can adopt a budget in a timely way. That's a good thing. That means you don't have the reputational injury of California can't get its act together and all of those national articles every year for a decade that sounded like we didn't know what we were doing. And so I think it affects ultimately business decisions about California and whether it's a manageable economy and things of that nature.
Well, let's talk about reputational injury, because you are the treasurer and you deal with bond ratings every single day.
Yes.
And those reputational injuries were really hurting our bond rating, which costs money for Californians.
Right.
So are we seeing are we getting the benefit of this vis-a-vis the bond market?
Well, there are some improvements in the ratings California gets. They don't do it overnight, so they want to see, is there a consistent trend where the structural deficit is getting reduced, which it is. It used to be much larger, and the governor and legislature are determined to get that zeroed out over a couple of more years. So that's the good trend. They want to see that. We also issue a lot of bonds in California, partly because we're the largest state and there's a lot of unmet needs for schools and transit and so on. So the volume affects how much your rate is going to be.
We have to talk about bonds because, as you know, 2 cities recently declared bankruptcy, thereby defaulting on several of their bonds. Stockton, the largest municipal bankruptcy in the country. Mammoth Lakes just declared bankruptcy. Give us your sense of what that means for the state of California.
Well, I'm not sure there's any ripple effect other than on their communities. So in Stockton, big cuts in city services have occurred, and obviously this will affect their ability to ever borrow in the future in order to build things that are locally necessary.
But it's a major city in our state. I mean,
yeah.
This
and
is
of course, as you know, they were hit very, very hard by the housing downturn and unemployment problems and so on. And prior to that, in the good years, they had done a lot of investing in public works that turned out to be bad timing. And so now they're experiencing these difficulties. But it doesn't seem endemic to lots and lots of other local agencies. Some of it was they over-relied on redevelopment agencies, and when the legislature and governor decided we're shutting down that, we're reprioritizing and putting money into schools rather than...
You're kind to state it that way.
Well, I think that's how I viewed it.
I want to ask you, though, about the concept of bankruptcy.
Yeah.
As you know, currently a state cannot declare bankruptcy. Now, I don't know that we're near that point. We may have been a few years ago, but there have been rumblings about whether a law should be passed federally that would allow states to declare bankruptcy. Some would say it would help states get out from under their overwhelming pension obligations, some of the bond obligations. What do you think?
Well, bad idea, and while it's been floated by some congressmen, everyone else, the Republicans and Democrats, said that's a crazy idea. We don't need to have states declaring bankruptcy. And truth is, California, I mean, some say it in a rhetorical way, meaning we're spending more than current income. But that doesn't mean you're bankrupt. It means you need to cut some spending or raise a tax.
I want to talk about spending because we hear time and time again that California has a spending problem.
Right.
Yet when I look at just the hard, cold facts, it appears that we are spending less than we did before the recession. We are spending less than under the Reagan governorship. I mean, what's the true answer? You can point to statistics any way you want.
Well, the statistics are pretty clear, I think. Now, I'm the banker, so
One should know.
I look at the numbers. And if Ronald Reagan was spending over $6 per $100 of income when he was governor, a conservative, and Brown is spending closer to $5 per 100, you can tell there's been a diminution, that we're spending now back at 37 years ago levels. Now there's been some special fund growth and debt, and it's kind of complicated, and if you can sort of find numbers to make the political point you'd want, but that's the general fund budget. That's schools and universities and prison system and healthcare. So
is this a perception problem?
Well, a lot of it is ideological. So it's, we used to say, well, I'll believe it when I see it, and unfortunately, a greater truism has become, I'll see it when I believe it. And so facts get sifted through people's ideological prisms, and they decide, well, government is bad, I want less government. Now I'll find some evidence or anecdote that supports that point of view.
But on the flip side, are we, at least those in the legislature on the Democratic side, too resistant to cuts? Are they too close to public unions?
Well,
that also is seen as a truism.
Well, it is true in the sense that I don't know what too close is. There are those that argue sort of what elected officials do is figure out who they're with, and that the four whats are derivative. And so, yes, the Democrats historically are with the middle class and lower, and Republicans tend to have more of an upper income bias and that sort of thing, and there's ethnic differences or whatever. So when you fight for teachers, does that mean that somehow you're too close to teachers? It's hard, I mean, that's a hard argument to make. Unless you could say, well, here's something you did because of that special relationship that injures the public good, is bad for students or something.
Bill Lockyer, we thank you for joining us. He is the treasurer of the great state of California. When we come back, we'll be speaking with 4 members of the Capitol Press Corps. My name is Brad Pomerantz. We'll be right back on California Connections. Welcome back to California Connections. I'm Brad Pomerantz. We are joined by our Sacramento Press Corps panel. First, I'd like to introduce you to Kevin Yamamura. He is with the Sacramento Bee. He is joined by Chris McGarrian with the Los Angeles Times, and then Brian Joseph with the Orange County Register. He is president of the Sacramento Press Club, and I thank you for joining us. We just spoke with Bill Lockyer, the treasurer of the great state of California, talking about the budget, but I want to ask you gentlemen about winners and losers in the recent budget battle. Who are your winners and losers?
Well, I think the biggest winner in this budget battle is going to be the political consultants in November.
No doubt.
The discussion with the budget negotiations focused primarily on Governor Brown's tax initiative, and I think people that are going to be working on those campaigns are going to be benefiting from all the attention that's having of that issue.
And what's remarkable about that budget is it relies upon the tax initiative passing. I mean, it's right in the budget. And if the initiative does not pass, we will start to see trigger cuts, which we'll talk about in a moment. What about losers?
Well, I think the Republicans undoubtedly are losers in this process. They had no voice whatsoever when it came to the budget negotiations because of Prop 25 that was passed by voters in 2010.
The majority vote budget. It used to be the Big Five. Now it's the Big Three, just the 2 Democratic leaders and the governor. Chris McGarrian, winners and losers.
I would say for losers, Republicans, but I even hesitate to say that because they almost didn't get a chance to play the game this year. I mean, they really weren't in any of the meetings.
At all.
They couldn't find any place where they could get leverage because of the majority vote. As far as winners, I think state parks are one of the winners. You're going to see 70 state parks close as of Sunday, but really only one of them stayed closed,
right? Which
is a huge turn of events for the park system.
But is that because of the budget or more because of public-private partnerships that were created out of the budget crisis?
It's mostly because of the public-private partnerships, but there was also more money put into the budget to keep some parks open for a little bit longer.
Kevin Yamamura, winners and losers?
Well, I think as Brian was discussing, a lot may depend on what we see happen in November. I mean, if that tax initiative fails, schools will be losers, presumably if they stick with those trigger cuts. But in this deal, I mean, you saw some of the winners. I mean, in one realm, I think SEIU actually won.
That's a public union, of course.
A public union in terms of like in-home care, where the cuts that Governor Brown had proposed were a lot deeper than what actually happened. Of course, SEIU also represents state workers who were losers in this, and insofar as they accepted 12 floating furlough days.
Right. I want to talk about welfare, essentially. You speak with Republican leaders, and they will constantly talk about the fact that we here have 1/3 of the country's welfare recipients in California, yet 1/8 of the population. Is that statistic fair, Kevin? I mean, does that really tell the story, or is it just a pithy quote?
No, when I've looked at the data, that's accurate. It has to do with a number of factors, including our demographics here. We do have a younger population that also is low income in nature.
Right.
And we also have a policy in California where we provide cash aid to families with kids where they don't have to meet work requirements. But a lot of times it ends up being parents of undocumented children. Undocumented parents of legal children.
Will that change under the new budget deal and the governor's vetoes as well?
They did not change that portion of the grant system where we have parents, about half of the recipients, the families that don't actually meet the work requirements already. They still receive some aid. California is somewhat unique in providing that aid to those families, in part because the Democratic legislators say they don't want to cut off the kids who rely on that money.
But speaking of kids, I want to talk about health care with you, Chris, and that is, we know as part of the plan, many children will be shifted off of healthy families and put into Medi-Cal. I don't want to get too high into the clouds, but what is the result of that?
Right, so you have nearly 900,000 children shifted into this other program over the course of next year. Advocates are worried that they're going to get worse health care in the Medi-Cal program, and doctors are worried that they're going to be reimbursed less from the state for that care. So that was one of the most contentious issues this year in the budget.
At the same time, we know, Brian, that the U.S. Supreme Court upheld, all but upheld, the Affordable Care Act, President Obama's health care plan. Was the budget anticipating that ruling, and how will Californians be impacted as such?
That's a great question. I actually don't know the answer to that, whether it anticipated the ruling. I think California is clear has been one of the first adopters of the Affordable Care Act. We were the first state to establish a health benefit exchange in California, and I think a lot of the nation is going to be watching how California now goes about implementing the Affordable Care Act. Do you folks know if it anticipated that ruling or not?
I'm pretty sure California is ready to move full speed ahead no matter what.
Right.
I don't think it was really a factor like, the taxes in November that they're expecting, voters will do a certain thing. They weren't saying, okay, if the Supreme Court does this, we'll do that. But California has a lot of its own health policies.
Let's talk about taxes, because I have to admit that I presumed that the tax initiative in the final analysis would probably pass. I just looked at the tea leaves. It feels like it would be time for the voters to say yes. Then there was this little election in June and had a little initiative on the ballot dealing with cigarettes. And here we are, one of the lowest propensity states for smoking, and yet a tax on cigarettes, $1 a pack, failed. It failed. I mean, it was a squeaker, but it failed. What does that say to you? Brian?
Well, I think it says to me that the old saw about an initiative having to have about 60% approval ratings before the negative ads.
Which
come
it
through.
did.
It did, and yet it still failed. I think that, at least according to common wisdom in Sacramento, suggests that the governor's initiative may have some problems. Its polling right now shows that it's a little bit above 50%. The presumption being that once the negative ads start coming in, that number will dip far below the necessary vote total to get to where he wants to go.
Chris McGarry, what do you think?
Well, I think the question on the cigarette tax is what were the stakes there? And the stakes were important. I think it had to do with cancer research. But for the tax measure, the stakes are billions of dollars cut from your public schools, your kids' schools. So I think voters will approach it with a different mindset.
But will voters hear that message, Kevin? I think about the CSU system has already said they are waitlisting everyone who applies this fall until they find out what happens in November. Governor Brown has said that if the measure doesn't pass, the school year will be cut by 3 weeks, K-12. Will voters hear that, and will they care?
I think the governor will get his message out. The question is whether, I mean, you mentioned Prop 29. The question is whether there'll be that kind of opposition. I mean, we saw nearly $50 million in opposition spent against that tobacco tax. So, it remains to be seen if there'll be any money to be spent against the governor's plan.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Molly Munger, a wealthy individual in herself, is spending millions of her own dollars to pass her own initiative, which is much more broad-based. The governors would increase taxes by 1/4 cent for 4 years, sales tax, 7 years for the wealthiest, whereas Ms. Munger's initiative is, I mean, it taxes everyone, 0.4% to I think 2.6%, or if that's what it is. Some could argue that's more, more fair. Right?
Well, I think the bigger issue surrounding Ms. Munger's initiative is how it's going to affect politically the governor's initiative. Right. I think a lot of people are expecting that she's going to come out with her own negative ads as reference to the governor's initiative, and that's going to create some sort of, at least believed to create some sort of confusion among voters, which one to support, which one to oppose.
Right. The governor doesn't want to fight two fronts at the same time.
And Kevin, what do you think about the fact that Ms. Munger, who had said she wasn't so much against the governor's initiative, but she has recently filed a lawsuit, it was very inside baseball, but about the placement of the initiative on the ballot. I mean,
I think the longer, you see that type of activity where these questions are raised about how fair has the governor been in terms of positioning his initiative, the longer that's in the news, it can't be good for the governor's tax initiative. I mean, he just wants to get on and start his campaign, talk about the things you mentioned, cuts to schools, potentially if this tax doesn't pass. The longer he has to worry about this positioning issue that is inside baseball, but still in voters' minds may raise some of these doubts.
Another inside baseball piece of news is whether the Democrats will take a 2/3 majority in the California State Senate. Those on the GOP side, those in the business community are very fearful of that. Whether that fear is justified, I don't know. But when you look at the tea leaves, Chris, do you think that there's a real legitimate shot that the Democrats take 2/3 in the state Senate?
My understanding is that there's a better shot in the state Senate than there is in the Assembly.
Right.
And Senator Steinberg, the Democratic leader in the Senate, is really hot on this, and he thinks that he just needs a little push.
Brian?
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up. I actually think the concerns that the business community has over this, may be a little unfounded. What's going to happen under a 2/3 majority for the Democrats is suddenly your moderate Democrats, the ones that are more business oriented, are going to have a lot more power in their caucuses.
And arguably there are more of those in the Senate than the Assembly.
There certainly is. There's certainly a number of moderate Democrats that have business interests at heart and that are suddenly going to have a lot more leverage now in a 2/3 majority situation.
In our final moments, what do you think, Kevin?
Yeah, I think Chris is right. I mean, the Senate is the place where Senator Steinberg has talked a lot about it. But you're right. I mean, it's just going to shift the power to that moderate section.
Brian Joseph, Chris McGarry, and Kevin Yamamura, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Brad Palmer. We thank you so much for watching California Connections.
There are many reasons not to like the budget passed by the legislature's Democrat majority. It is fiscally irresponsible. It relies on a questionable $50 billion tax increase. It holds education hostage. And it's full of gimmicks and unrealistic assumptions that ensure continued deficits in the future. Not to mention, it does nothing about public pensions and throws billions at a high-speed rail project that voters don't want. Bottom line, it lacks the transparency and inclusion to ensure accountability. The fact that the budget was on time doesn't make it a good budget. This budget will only prolong the economic and budgetary mismanagement that has plagued Californians for years. The budget essentially pushes our fiscal problems into next year, where the challenge will be even greater because of the failure to act responsibly today. The governor may have signed a budget, but the voters will have the last word in November.
For the second straight year, California has an on-time budget. While there's always some sense of relief and satisfaction when the budget is put to bed, it is also sobering. By necessity, we have made more deep cuts. And those cuts are not just a number on a piece of paper. They are real people, real lives being affected. But the era of interminably late budgets is behind us in California. And this year we have laid the groundwork to turn the corner and put these unending deficits behind us. This year's budget is balanced. It is also balanced for next year and the year after. It ends the 4-year forecast period with a $2 billion surplus. And we will continue to do the hard, necessary work to improve the economy and the lives of Californians. We just became the first state in the nation to pass comprehensive foreclosure reform, helping hundreds of thousands of responsible Californians to stay in their homes. We will complete public pension reform in August, cutting government costs and stabilizing the financial footing of our retirement system. We are poised to take our case to the voters in November for modest tax increases. Our kids and our families cannot afford to lose billions of dollars in investment in public education and higher education. With that success, we'll have a balanced budget going forward and get our economy growing. And making that happen is good for all Californians. Thank you.